They say humans are social creatures, that happiness lives in crowds. Laughter echoes louder in groups, and a life filled with people is a life well lived. But reality often whispers something very different. There are people who quietly step away from the noise, not because they hate the world, but because the world feels too loud. In a culture that celebrates constant connection, choosing solitude can look suspicious. Friends ask if something is wrong. Family wonders if loneliness has taken hold. But what if the opposite is true? What if the people who seek solitude are not escaping life, but experiencing it more deeply? Why do some minds feel clearer in silence? Why do certain hearts recharge in empty rooms rather than crowded gatherings? And what hidden psychology lives behind the quiet choice to be alone? Because sometimes solitude is not isolation. Sometimes it is self-preservation. And sometimes it is where the truest parts of a person finally breathe. In this reflection, something deeper begins to unfold. Let's begin. From an early age, a quiet message begins to shape the way solitude is viewed. The happiest people are the most social. The most successful people are surrounded by others. And the most fulfilled lives are always full of voices. Classrooms reward group participation. Workplaces celebrate networking. Parties are seen as proof of belonging. And slowly, without anyone noticing, a subtle equation forms in the collective mind. Being alone must mean something is missing. So when someone chooses silence instead of noise, when they step away from gatherings, when they decline invitations not out of anger but simply out of preference, people begin to wonder, are they okay? The question often carries quiet concern, but sometimes it carries judgment, because in a world built around constant connection, solitude looks unusual. Someone who enjoys their own company may be called shy, or distant, or antisocial, sometimes even arrogant. But what if those labels say more about society's discomfort with silence than about the person themselves? Not every quiet person is lonely, and not every crowded life feels connected. There are individuals who can sit in a room full of people, laugh at the right moments, say the expected words, yet still feel strangely disconnected inside. And then there are others who sit alone on a quiet evening, reading, thinking, observing the world through a window, and feel completely at peace. The difference is rarely visible from the outside, because solitude is often mistaken for absence of friends, absence of joy, absence of belonging. But for many people, solitude is not emptiness. It is space. Space to think without interruption, space to feel without performance, space where identity is not shaped by expectations or reactions from others. In silence, something unusual happens. The mind begins to slow down. Thoughts that were once buried under conversations, notifications, and obligations quietly rise to the surface. Questions appear, reflections deepen, and emotions that were once drowned out by noise finally become audible. For some individuals, this space is not uncomfortable, it is necessary. Yet society often struggles to understand this, because silence can be unsettling. It reveals things that distraction usually hides. And for those who depend on constant activity to avoid their inner world, someone who willingly enters that quiet space can feel mysterious, even strange. But the truth is far simpler. Some people are not running away from others. They are simply moving closer to themselves. And that difference changes everything. Long before someone consciously chooses solitude, something subtle is already taking shape inside them. Not all minds experience the world in the same way. Some people feel energized by activity, voices overlapping, conversations flowing, rooms full of movement and laughter. But for others, the same environment can feel overwhelming. Too many sounds, too many emotional signals, too many invisible expectations to respond, react, perform. For certain personalities, the nervous system processes stimulation more deeply. Psychologists often describe this as high sensitivity or introversion, not weakness, but a different way of interacting with the world. These minds absorb more detail. They notice the tone beneath someone's words, the shift in someone's mood across a room, the subtle tension hiding inside a smile. And because they are constantly processing so much information, their mental energy drains faster in crowded environments. Silence, in contrast, feels restorative. It allows the mind to reset. But personality is only part of the story. Early emotional environments also shape how comfortable someone becomes with solitude. Some children grow up in homes where noise feels chaotic. Arguments erupt unpredictably. Emotions fill the room without warning. For these children, quiet spaces become safe spaces. A bedroom door closed, a book opened, a quiet corner where the world finally softens. Over time, solitude stops feeling like isolation. It becomes protection. For others, the path is different. They may have grown up feeling misunderstood, their thoughts moving deeper than the conversations around them. While others talked easily about surface things, their minds wandered toward questions about meaning, purpose, identity. And slowly, they began to notice something. The world often moves quickly, but their inner world moves slowly, carefully, reflectively. In busy social environments, there is rarely time for that kind of depth. Conversations skim across the surface, moments pass quickly. But in solitude, something changes. The mind can linger, questions can unfold without interruption. Ideas can stretch and evolve like rivers carving through quiet landscapes. This is where many people first begin to feel at home inside their own thoughts. Not because they dislike people, but because silence offers something that constant interaction rarely does: space for authenticity. In solitude, there is no role to perform, no expectation to entertain, no subtle pressure to shape reactions for the comfort of others. Just the simple experience of existing, exactly as the mind naturally moves. And over time, something important becomes clear. Being alone is not something to escape. It is something that feels strangely familiar, almost like returning to a place that has always been there, waiting quietly.
Silence does something unusual to the human brain. At first, it can feel uncomfortable. In a quiet room, without distractions, the mind suddenly becomes louder. Thoughts appear that were previously hidden beneath conversations, music, and endless notifications. Many people instinctively reach for noise again. A television turned on, a phone unlocked, a message sent, anything to fill the silence. But for some individuals, something different happens. Instead of resisting the quiet, their mind begins to settle into it. Because the brain is not designed only for activity, it is also designed for reflection. In neuroscience, there is a network often called the default mode network, a system of brain regions that becomes active when external tasks fade away. This network awakens during moments of rest, during long walks, during quiet evenings, during the gentle stillness of solitude. And when it activates, the brain begins doing something remarkable. It starts connecting pieces of experience. Memories link with emotions, ideas combine with imagination, questions search for deeper meaning. In other words, the brain begins to process life. This is why many creative insights appear during quiet moments rather than busy ones. A writer suddenly understands a character. An artist sees an image that wasn't visible before. A person finally realizes why a certain memory still hurts. Silence creates the conditions for clarity. For individuals who prefer solitude, this mental state becomes deeply familiar. Their thoughts do not simply pass through their minds, they explore them, turn them around, examine their edges. A simple question can lead to layers of reflection. Why did that conversation feel uncomfortable? Why do certain moments stay in memory longer than others? Why do some relationships feel peaceful while others feel heavy? These questions rarely surface in crowded environments because social spaces demand quick responses, quick smiles, quick laughter, quick shifts between topics. But the human mind is capable of far deeper exploration than that, and solitude opens that doorway. There is another quiet effect as well. When stimulation decreases, emotional regulation improves. The nervous system slows down. Breathing becomes calmer. Heart rate steadies. The body shifts out of constant alertness. This is why many people who spend time alone report feeling mentally restored afterward. Not empty, but clearer, like water that has finally stopped being stirred. Of course, solitude does not mean the mind becomes peaceful all the time. Sometimes it reveals difficult thoughts, unanswered questions, old emotions that were easier to ignore in busy environments. But even that has value, because awareness begins where distraction ends. And for certain minds, silence is not frightening. It is simply the place where understanding begins.
Something subtle begins to grow in long stretches of solitude. At first, it may simply feel like quiet, but over time, that quiet becomes something else, an inner landscape. Many people move through the world primarily focused on the outside: conversations, schedules, obligations, constant activity. Their attention is directed outward. But people who spend time alone often experience the opposite shift. Their attention slowly turns inward, not in a self-absorbed way, but in a curious one. Thoughts are no longer background noise. They become objects of observation. A question appears in the mind, and instead of being dismissed, it is followed. Where did that feeling come from? Why did that moment stay in memory? Why do certain people bring calm while others bring tension? In solitude, there is finally enough space for these questions to unfold. And something fascinating begins to happen. The inner world becomes detailed, like a vast landscape slowly revealed by morning light. Memories resurface with new meaning. A childhood moment suddenly explains a present emotion. A past conversation reveals something that was not understood at the time. Patterns begin to appear. Connections form between events that once seemed unrelated. This is the quiet work of reflection, and for those who live comfortably in solitude, reflection becomes almost natural. Not forced, not intellectualized, just present. The imagination also begins to expand in these quiet spaces. Without constant external input, the mind starts creating its own worlds. Ideas evolve freely, stories take shape, possibilities stretch further than ordinary conversations often allow. This is why many thinkers, writers, artists, and philosophers throughout history have cherished solitude. Not because they rejected people, but because creativity often requires silence. Yet the inner world is not only about imagination, it is also about emotional awareness. In busy environments, emotions can easily be ignored. Laughter covers discomfort, activity masks sadness. But in solitude, emotions have nowhere to hide. If something hurts, it becomes visible. If something feels meaningful, it becomes clearer. This awareness can feel intense at times, but it also builds something rare: self-understanding. The ability to recognize one's own patterns, one's fears, one's hopes, one's contradictions. And slowly, through this quiet observation, a person begins to understand themselves not through labels, but through experience. However, this inner depth can also create distance from certain social environments. Because when someone spends time exploring meaning, surface-level conversations can sometimes feel strangely empty. Not wrong, just incomplete. And so people who cherish solitude often learn to move gently between two worlds. the outer world of activity and conversation, and the inner world of reflection and understanding. One visible, one invisible. Both real, both shaping who they become.
In many social environments, something invisible is constantly happening. Energy is moving, expressions are being read, words are being interpreted, emotions are subtly exchanged between people. For most individuals, this process happens almost automatically. They move through conversations easily, jokes bounce across the room, stories unfold quickly. But for certain minds, social spaces require much more effort than they appear to on the surface. Every interaction contains layers, tone, body language, unspoken expectations. A simple conversation can carry dozens of emotional signals at once. Someone smiles, but their eyes reveal tension. Someone laughs, but their voice carries a hint of frustration. Someone says they are fine, but their silence afterward tells a different story. For individuals who naturally notice these subtleties, social environments become dense with information. The brain is constantly interpreting, constantly filtering, constantly responding. Over time, this quiet processing begins to drain mental energy, not because people are disliked, but because the mind is working harder than others might realize. Crowds can amplify this effect. Multiple conversations overlapping, music filling the background, movement happening in every direction. For some people, this environment feels exciting. For others, it feels overwhelming. The nervous system becomes overloaded with stimulation. Attention jumps from one signal to another. Emotional cues stack on top of each other like waves. And after a while, the mind begins to crave something simple. Silence. Not as escape, but as recovery. Solitude becomes a place where the nervous system can finally rest, where the mind is no longer required to interpret every gesture, every tone, every subtle shift in mood, where thoughts can slow down again, where the body can return to calm. This is why many people who enjoy solitude often describe a strange pattern in their lives. They may enjoy certain social moments deeply, a meaningful conversation, a quiet dinner with someone who understands them, a shared moment of laughter that feels genuine. But large social environments can leave them feeling drained afterward, even when nothing negative happened, even when the evening was pleasant, because the cost of navigating those spaces is not always visible. It happens inside the mind, inside the nervous system, inside the quiet emotional awareness that never fully switches off. And so, solitude becomes more than preference. It becomes balance, a way to return to center after the noise of the world. A quiet room, a slow breath, a moment where the mind no longer needs to interpret everything around it. Just exist. For many people who prefer solitude, there comes a quiet turning point. It rarely arrives suddenly. There is no dramatic moment, no clear announcement that something has changed. Instead, it unfolds slowly through experience. At first, the desire for solitude may feel confusing. After social gatherings, exhaustion appears without an obvious reason. After long conversations, the mind feels foggy, and a quiet thought begins to surface. Why does being alone feel so much better? But this question often comes with doubt, because society rarely celebrates solitude. Friends might say, "You should get out more." Family members might worry, "Are you isolating yourself?" Even the person themselves may wonder if something is wrong, if perhaps they are missing something everyone else seems to enjoy so easily. So they try to adjust. They attend more gatherings, they stay longer at events, they push themselves to match the rhythm of the people around them. And sometimes it works for a while. But eventually the same pattern returns. The quiet exhaustion, the mental overload, the deep relief that arrives the moment silence returns. And slowly, something important becomes clear. The problem was never solitude. The problem was the belief that solitude needed to be fixed. This realization can feel strangely liberating,
Because once that belief dissolves, a new kind of permission appears. Permission to leave earlier, permission to decline invitations without guilt, permission to protect quiet time as something meaningful rather than something strange. Solitude transforms in that moment. It stops being something that happens by accident. It becomes a conscious choice, a personal boundary, a quiet act of self-respect. People who reach this turning point often begin to notice something else as well. Their relationships become more genuine, because instead of forcing themselves into constant interaction, they engage when they truly have the energy and desire to connect. Conversations become deeper, presence becomes more authentic. The time spent with others is no longer drained by obligation. It is chosen, and because it is chosen, it carries more meaning. At the same time, solitude itself begins to change. It no longer feels like a retreat from the world. It becomes a place of restoration, a place where the mind resets, where emotions settle, where identity becomes clearer without the noise of expectations. In that quiet space, a person begins to feel something that many people spend years searching for: comfort with themselves. Not because everything inside them is perfectly understood, but because they have stopped running from their own presence. And that quiet acceptance becomes its own kind of strength.
To many people, the image looks the same. A person sitting alone at a cafe, walking alone through a park, spending a quiet evening without messages or company. From the outside, it can appear lonely, but appearances rarely reveal the emotional truth of solitude. Because loneliness and solitude may share the same setting, yet they feel completely different on the inside. Loneliness is not simply the absence of people, it is the absence of connection. A person can sit in the middle of a crowded room, surrounded by conversations and laughter, and still feel deeply lonely. Because loneliness emerges when the heart longs to be understood, but cannot find a place where it truly is. Solitude, however, carries a different emotional texture. It is not driven by absence, it is chosen. In solitude, a person is not waiting for connection to arrive. They already feel connected, just not in the way society expects. Connected to their thoughts, connected to their feelings, connected to the quiet rhythm of their own mind. This difference may seem subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. Loneliness drains energy. It creates a sense of emotional hunger. The mind searches constantly for reassurance that someone, somewhere, understands. Solitude does the opposite. It replenishes. Instead of searching outward for validation, the mind begins to feel stable within itself. This stability creates a quiet independence. A person who is comfortable in solitude does not depend entirely on external noise to feel alive. Their sense of presence comes from something internal, a calm awareness of their own thoughts, their own pace, their own emotional landscape. This does not mean they reject relationships. In fact, many people who appreciate solitude also value connection very deeply. But they seek a specific kind of connection, one that feels genuine, unforced. A conversation where silence is allowed. A friendship that does not require constant performance. A relationship where both people can exist side by side, without filling every moment with words. These connections are rare, but when they appear, they feel profoundly meaningful. Because someone who is comfortable with solitude does not need company to escape themselves. They seek company that adds something real to their experience. Not noise, not distraction, but understanding. And until that kind of connection appears, solitude does not feel like loss. It feels like peace. A quiet room, a calm mind. A moment where a person is fully present with their own existence, without the fear of being alone. And in that stillness, something important becomes visible. Being alone and feeling lonely are not the same story, not even close.
There is a quiet strength that grows in people who learn to be alone. It does not appear suddenly. It develops slowly, in silent evenings, in long walks, in moments where no one else is present to shape the atmosphere. At first, solitude simply feels like space. But over time, something deeper begins to form within that space. Self-trust. When a person spends time with their own thoughts, they begin to recognize the patterns of their inner voice. They learn which fears are temporary, which emotions pass like weather, and which quiet instincts deserve attention. Without constant external influence, the mind becomes more familiar with itself, and familiarity slowly becomes confidence. Not loud confidence, not the kind that demands attention, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows they can sit with their own mind and not feel afraid. This inner stability changes the way a person moves through the world. They become less dependent on approval, less shaken by rejection, less pressured by the invisible expectations that often shape social life. Because when someone has learned how to exist peacefully in solitude, something important shifts. Their sense of worth stops relying entirely on how others respond to them. Instead, it begins to grow from a quieter place, a place inside. This does not mean life becomes perfectly calm. There will still be moments of doubt, moments when loneliness briefly appears, moments when connection is deeply missed. After all, the human heart still longs for understanding. But the difference is this: solitude has already taught them something essential. They know how to return to themselves. They know how to listen to their own thoughts without panic. They know how to sit in silence without feeling incomplete. And because of that, their relationships become more intentional. They do not seek people simply to avoid emptiness. They seek people who add meaning, people who respect quiet moments, people who understand that silence is not awkward, but peaceful, people who can sit beside them in the same calm space without needing to fill it. This is the quiet strength of solitude, not separation from the world, but independence within it. The ability to walk through crowded places without losing connection to one's inner voice. The ability to step away from noise without feeling guilty. The ability to exist fully, whether surrounded by people or sitting alone with the gentle rhythm of one's own thoughts. And perhaps that is the deeper truth behind solitude. It is not the absence of life. It is the space where life can finally be heard. If this reflection made you feel seen, if parts of this quiet experience felt familiar, then perhaps something inside you already understands what solitude truly is. Not loneliness, not disconnection, but a different way of moving through the world, a slower rhythm, a deeper listening, a quiet relationship with your own mind. Many people carry this experience silently, believing they are unusual for needing space, silence, or distance from constant noise. But the truth is, they are far from alone. There are countless minds that feel most alive in calm rooms, thoughtful conversations, and moments where the world slows down enough for reflection. If you would like to stay connected to a space that explores these quiet corners of human psychology, you're gently welcome here. This channel exists as a place to reflect on the hidden emotions, inner patterns, and silent experiences that shape the human heart. And if you ever feel comfortable sharing, you may write something in the comments. Sometimes a single sentence about your experience can help someone else realize they are not alone in their thoughts, but only if it feels right to you. There is no pressure here, only space. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.